Hey there everyone! As you can tell, I decided to take the extra day I mentioned that I might take in last week's updates in order to get some extra work done. And the good news is, it paid off pretty damn well. Now, before I talk about anything specific related to the development, however, I'd like to start this video by saying, happy belated birthday to the Fantabuloso game! Back on August 25th, 2015, I posted the first progress update on the blog. Since then, the game's progressed a mind-bogglingly large amount, rapidly approaching the point where it's a playable, real, actual, tangible product. Last year, in order to celebrate this anniversary, I showed off a bunch of comparison shots of the original game, Fantabuloso game, and also how the development of the game progressed to how things were looking at that point. Obviously, visually, there's not a whole lot that's changed in the past year, which has mostly been spent on mechanics and level design. But the fact that there's been some level design means I can show off the differences in the level itself. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it since it's not as interesting of a comparison as, say, the Sphere Friends were, since, the core geometry of the level is just radically different than it used to be. But it's still neat to see how far my level design abilities come in the 4.5 years since Fantabuloso game's original release. One thing's for sure as we look at it from down here. The Shamrocks are certainly a bit better at making intimidating architecture built on top of mountains now. Now, as imposing as it is from down here, it's a much less interesting shot than up above, so let's take a trip back up top. Picking up from where we left off last week, I've made some changes to these moving platforms. I've added in some little slots in the walls to make the pipes look a bit more natural coming in and out of them, and I've put in a third pipe to make the platforming a bit easier. It was way too tricky and long of a jump before. I had like 4 takes where I didn't make the jump in the footage I had recorded. Once Catboy makes it across these, he encounters a sort of crossroads, one path of which seems to be swarming with malfunctioning Shamrock robots. I'm afraid you'll have to wait for the demo to see what the deal with them is, though. Gotta leave some surprises for release. As long as this is the anniversary update, though, I will mention that this is intended to be the equivalent of the helipad that was back in Fantabuloso game. The new one's just a little bit more interesting for some reason, isn't it? Moving down the other path, the infestation of red vines is growing noticeably worse. Catboy needs to carefully maneuver around them while keeping up with a floating platform, which is seemingly suffering from the same interference that the robots at the Shampad were. After making it through this miniature gauntlet, he finds himself on a path that seemingly leads up to the peak at long last. Passing by a massive cannon aimed directly at the Sphere Friend capital, Carnivis, he clambers up a series of red vines and finally manages to make it to the top. Confused by how the Crags managed to build an effigy all the way up here, he decides to just not question it and moves on, hoping to get some answers for where his dog is from whoever waits at the top of the mountain. Speaking of the mountaintop, you'll have noticed that I've improved its visuals substantially. The entire platform is surrounded by the red vine infestation, giving it a much more foreboding feeling and just generally making it look quite a bit more interesting. Afraid to say, though, that I'm not going to give you guys any more information on what actually lies within the tangled walls, however. On the subject of no more information, I'm afraid to say that that's just about it for the content I'm both willing and able to show off in this update. While this seems like a very minor amount of work, especially in comparison to my goals I had set for last week, in reality, I'm only showing you guys the products of about 50% of the work I've put in this week. While this doesn't mean I'm actually hiding, exactly twice the content, it does mean that a very large amount of my work time went towards spoilery stuff that also happened to be abnormally time-consuming, just because I was going about it the wrong way and blah blah blah. Doesn't really matter since you guys don't even know what it is. There's also been a fairly decent amount of bug fixing and tweaking that I wasn't really keeping great track of, so I can't really talk about it in depth. So, naturally, with that unfortunate truth out of the way, the question now is, what's next up on the agenda? The good news is I have an extremely solid and achievable plan. With the spoilery stuff out of the way, all I have left to do in the exterior now, not including the detailing like windows and grass and rocks here and there and stuff like that, is figure out how to fill in this little area here on the east side of the Fightyplace and finally get around to making that pillar-mounted artillery cannon I've been talking about. Or maybe I'll just come up with a new plan for this pillar entirely, I'm not really sure yet. After that, I'm going to move on to the interior. While it's not an area that I have a whole lot of actual progress done on yet, it's pretty much just the dog jail right now, it's an area that I have planned out nearly perfectly in my head. It's also an area with very little in terms of things I can't show off, if that makes sense. So no spoilery stuff that'll take up 50% of the dev time. At the very least, I'll be able to briefly touch on all the stuff I've gotten done by next week in terms of level design. Finally, there are a couple of minor platforming changes I want to get done before I move on to the combat overhaul, which is up next after the level design. I've decided that I want Catboy to latch onto and slide down walls while wall jumping, not super slowly or super generously, but the wall jumping right now just doesn't really feel right. And I also want to give him an impact animation when he falls from extremely high heights. I don't want to give him actual fall damage, I think that would just be really annoying, especially since combat is such a huge part of the game. But rather, I want to give him some sort of animation and maybe a stun just to make the massive falls seem more natural, instead of him just... Someone mentioned in the comments last week that it just looks weird when he just falls from like 200 feet in the air and just lands on his feet instantly into his idle pose. So, point is, all of that stuff is all the stuff that I've got planned for next week's update. It's my last week before university starts, so I want to make it a really productive one, so I'll have that extra pressure and that extra drive to actually buckle in and focus. Also, with my designer's block out of the way and cleared up, I think I ought to be able to pull it off, no sweat. We'll find out next weekend, but I have high hopes. As always, you guys can check out the description for links to other development information, like the blog, or the Trello, or the Discord, and stuff like that. And feel free to subscribe if you want to stay up to date with the game and its progress through these weekly update videos. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and I'll catch you guys next week.